Hola? What's the weather like where you are today? Sunny, rainy, cloudy? Comment below.
It had been years since we were all around that table, and if I'm being honest, I only said yes to coming because Carly told me I might regret it if I didn't. Regret is a tricky thing. It doesn't announce itself right away. It simmers, like a pot left on low, until one day it overflows and burns whatever's left. The house smelled like rosemary, chicken, and candles, the same scent my mother always used, a mix of comfort and manipulation. That scent that says, everything's fine, even when everything is quietly falling apart. The chairs were in their usual places, the wine glasses were filled with a Pinot she'd been saving for something special, and the plates were her old wedding china, not because the dinner was important, but because Daniel was home, and that made it special by default. Daniel was already talking when I stepped through the door, some story about his promotion and the square footage of the new house, and Mom was soaking it up like sunlight, nodding along with that half-open mouth smile she does when she's proud, like she's been validated by someone else's life choices. Dad was at the head of the table, pretending to care, nodding at the right moments, though his eyes were already a little glassy from his first whiskey. He never liked confrontation. He liked peace, or at least the illusion of it, even if that meant ignoring when things were clearly broken. Daniel's wife, Mallory, smiled at me, polite but distant, like someone trained in how to be just warm enough without giving anything away. We used to be closer, in those rare years when I thought I still had a place in the family. Now we were just faces in each other's scenery. The seat next to me was empty, deliberately. I had told Carly not to come inside. She was parked a few blocks away, waiting in the car with a podcast and a thermos of tea. It wasn't because she wasn't welcome, well, maybe it was, but more because this wasn't her fight. It had never been her responsibility to pull me out of this family's gravitational field. She had done it anyway, for years, slowly and carefully, the way you guide someone blindfolded through a minefield. I owed her everything, and part of repaying that debt meant protecting her from these moments, the ones where you walk into a room filled with your own blood and still feel like a stranger. We'd only just made it through the salad when Mom, still grinning like she'd just hit the jackpot, placed her fork down and clapped her hands lightly, a gesture she'd always used when she wanted attention. "Your brother," she said, dragging the word out like it meant more than just a sibling title, "just bought a dream home. Right near the water in Charleston. 5 bedrooms. Wraparound porch. Just beautiful." Her eyes sparkled as she looked around the table, waiting for applause. Daniel did that humble shrug he'd perfected years ago, the one that says, "I'm amazing, but let's not make it weird." Everyone responded on cue, oohing and awing, lifting their glasses, offering the kind of praise that never seemed to be rationed out for anything anyone else did. And then, just as the conversation lulled, she turned to me. Her smile didn't fade, but it sharpened, just slightly, like a knife polished to a shine. "And you," she said, letting the word linger, like it was something unpleasant she found on her shoe, "when will you finally settle down, honey?" The air shifted. I felt it in my bones. Mallory looked down. Dad scratched his neck and stared at the breadbasket like it held answers. Daniel took another sip of wine, clearly used to being a spectator in the show. I reached for my own glass, red wine, dry, slightly bitter, and I let the silence stretch longer than was comfortable. Then I smiled, not wide, not fake, just enough to hold everything back. "Already did," I said, voice low and calm. "You just wouldn't know, you've never asked." The sentence landed like a needle dropped in a church. No explosion. Just pure, stunned quiet. Her smile faltered for half a second before she gathered herself, rearranged her features, and gave that tight-lipped nod people do when they don't understand something but refuse to ask. "Well, that's good, dear," she said, her voice brittle. "I'm glad." But she wasn't. I could see it. Not because she cared that she didn't know, but because it meant she was losing control of the narrative, the family scrapbook she curated with precision, the one where Daniel was the front cover and I was a faded tab she kept forgetting to remove. I didn't press. I didn't elaborate. That was the point. She could have asked for years. About my life, my home, my partner. She never did. She was too busy shaping the version of me that made sense to her, the one who was drifting, independent to a fault, hard to read. And now that I had handed her a truth she didn't know how to process, she had no script. For the first time, she couldn't frame it, couldn't twist it into a joke or a cautionary tale. Dinner dragged on after that. Someone passed the potatoes. Dad cleared his throat. Mallory asked about traffic. The moment moved on, like all awkward moments do when people are too afraid to look it in the eye. But I noticed her hands trembled slightly when she reached for the wine, and she didn't finish her chicken. That was enough for me. After dessert, I made my excuses. I said I had an early morning, thanked her for the meal, kissed her cheek lightly, and walked out into the night. The air was crisp and clean, a stark contrast to the weight I'd left behind in that room. Carly was waiting just where she said she'd be, behind the wheel, the dome light off, window cracked. She didn't ask how it went. She just reached over, took my hand, and held it as we drove away in silence. That's what love looks like, not a porch in Charleston or 5 bedrooms filled with matching linens. It's quiet loyalty. It's patience. It's someone who shows up for you even when your own mother can't be bothered to ask what your life actually looks like. I didn't look back as we turned the corner. I didn't need to, because something in that house had finally cracked, and once cracks start, it's only a matter of time before the whole thing starts to fall. There's a kind of silence that grows roots inside you, not the peaceful kind that follows a good conversation or the quiet comfort of sitting beside someone you love, but the kind that comes from years of being politely ignored, of watching every achievement get filed away under nice, but not Daniel, and every pain treated as self-inflicted, irrelevant, or simply inconvenient. I used to think I was imagining it, the imbalance, the weight of always coming second to someone who never had to try that hard. For a long time, I convinced myself I was just oversensitive or maybe even selfish, because when everyone around you is nodding and smiling and calling it normal, it's easier to doubt your gut than it is to question the whole damn system that raised you. But as I sat in the passenger seat of Carly's car that night, staring out the window at rows of darkened houses lit only by porch lights and weak garden lanterns, I felt it in my bones that the distance between me and my family hadn't grown by accident. It had been carved, little by little, moment by moment, in ways so subtle and consistent it took years to see them clearly. And once I did, I couldn't unsee a single one. It always started with Daniel. Everything did. He was born first, but even if he hadn't been, they would have chosen him anyway. The golden boy with the easy smile, the athletic trophies, the high school girlfriends who looked like cheerleaders from TV shows. The boy who didn't have to try hard because Mom always made sure the world bent just enough to meet him where he stood. When he brought home B's, they said he was well-rounded. When I brought home A's, they asked why I hadn't made valedictorian. When he skipped chores, he was tired from football. When I did the same, I was lazy or moody or going through something. There was a year, I must have been around 13, when I stayed up every night for weeks painting a series of portraits for the local youth art competition. I worked in silence in the garage, freezing my fingers in November air while everyone else watched TV inside. I painted faces of people I imagined, not celebrities or family members, but strangers whose expressions I couldn't stop seeing in my mind. I won first place. Out of 200 entries. The award came with a little ceremony and a ribbon, and even a check, nothing huge, just enough to make me feel like I'd done something worthwhile. I remember handing the invitation to Mom at the breakfast table, her eyes skimming it for half a second before she asked if it would conflict with Daniel's soccer match that Saturday. It did. She went to the game. I remember walking up to the stage alone, wearing a dress I had borrowed from a neighbor because we couldn't afford anything new, clutching the ribbon like it might fall apart if I let go too soon. No one took a photo. No one cheered. I smiled anyway. That was the beginning of the pretending, the moment I realized that if I waited for applause, I'd die standing still. Years later, when I brought Carly home for the first and only time, I was still naive enough to think maybe things had changed. We'd been dating almost 2 years, had just signed the lease on a tiny 2-bedroom place with creaky floors and old cabinets, but it felt like home because it was ours. I told Mom in advance. I used the word partner, tried to ease it in gently, even told her Carly was smart, sweet, a teacher who worked with kids with learning disabilities. I figured that would earn some points. It didn't. We arrived on a Sunday, unannounced except for my text the night before. She opened the door with that smile she uses when company comes over, all teeth and performance, and greeted Carly like she was some distant cousin she didn't quite remember. We had dinner, the three of us, and Carly tried, really tried, complimented the cooking, asked about Dad, offered to help with dishes. I could see her heart breaking with every forced nod from Mom, every time she was talked over, every time I was referred to as my daughter who lives with a friend. Afterward, in the car, Carly asked me if she'd done something wrong. I told her no. I told her it wasn't her. But the truth was, she never had a chance. Because by then, my mother had already written my story, and it didn't include a woman sitting beside me holding my hand in the dark. That night, I wrote a long message to Mom, not a confrontation, not angry, just honest, telling her how much it hurt to watch her pretend, how small it made me feel that she couldn't call Carly by name, couldn't acknowledge what we were, who we were. She never replied. Not once. And a week later, she mailed me a birthday card with a check inside and a note that read, "Hope you're doing well. We miss you." I didn't cash the check. I didn't send it back either. I just let it sit in the drawer with all the other things I didn't know what to do with: old letters, ticket stubs, keys to apartments we no longer lived in. I thought about throwing it away, but somehow keeping it felt like more of a protest. Like if I didn't use it, she couldn't say she had done something kind. She couldn't tell herself she had tried. Over the years, I stopped calling as often. I stopped sending holiday cards. I didn't bother with small talk when we did talk. I let the silence stretch, because it was easier to live in the space where nothing was said than in the space where everything said was fake. I built a life with Carly slowly, carefully, beautifully, and in that life, we didn't need approval or applause. We needed honesty, presence, truth. And we had all of that. Every day. But the strange thing about families like mine is that they never think they're the problem. They think silence is maturity, and pretending is love. They pat themselves on the back for not making it a big deal, when what they really mean is, we'd rather not look too closely. So that night, after dinner, as Carly and I pulled into our driveway, the one lined with wildflowers and cracked pavement and hand-painted stepping stones, I realized I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't waiting for them to change. I wasn't hoping for some sudden revelation or apology. I was just ready. Ready to be done playing the quiet one. Ready to take back my story. And as the porch light flickered on, and the scent of fresh lavender from Carly's garden filled the air, I knew the next time I saw my family, I wouldn't be the daughter who kept her mouth shut to keep the peace. Because the thing about being forgotten for long enough is that eventually, you stop caring what they remember. And that's when you finally start living. There's something oddly liberating about disappearing, not in the dramatic, packed a bag in the middle of the night sort of way, but slowly, over time, in small deliberate choices that add up: skipping calls, leaving texts unanswered, not showing up for birthdays that never quite felt like they were meant for you anyway, and eventually reaching a place where your absence no longer registers as rebellion, but simply becomes the new normal, a quiet removal that no one dares question too deeply. Because deep down, they know the answer would be uncomfortable. And so, I disappeared from their version of the story, but in doing so, I finally got the chance to write my own, a story that didn't start and end with my brother's shadow, a story that didn't require translation or apology. It began not with fireworks or some cinematic moment of clarity, but with a broken-down rental and a dirt road that nearly ate my tires alive. Carly had found the listing online, some forgotten corner of the county where no one we knew had ever thought to look. It was a crooked little farmhouse with flaking white paint, a sagging porch, and ivy choking its windows, but it sat on 3 acres of uncut field, bordered by pine and oak, and had a view of the sky so wide it felt like being on another planet. We spent our first night there on a blow-up mattress, eating cereal out of coffee mugs, listening to the wind howl through holes in the siding, laughing like idiots because everything smelled like mildew and old animals. And we were both convinced the attic was hiding a ghost or a raccoon or maybe both. But even then, even in that mess, it felt more like home than any place I had ever lived before. It took years to make it livable. We learned how to tile floors from YouTube, bartered with neighbors for tools we didn't own, painted every wall by hand even when our wrists cramped up and the paint dried in streaks. I built shelves from salvaged wood, Carly planted herbs in cracked buckets, and slowly, the house began to change. But more than that, we changed. We grew into ourselves without the noise of expectations, without the constant need to explain or justify or play roles that had never really fit. There was no one watching, no one grading us, no one quietly disappointed in the background. Just us. And in that silence, we became something solid. People in town got used to us quickly. There was no fanfare, no sideways glances, or if there were, we were too busy living to notice. We hosted book clubs on the back porch, started a small produce stand by the roadside, and even taught a weekend art class at the community center. Carly ran the logistics while I handled the painting lessons. Our days were full but not rushed, our nights quiet but never lonely. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't remarkable by any big city standards, but it was real. It was ours. I think what struck me most, in the years that followed, was how easy it became to stop missing people who had never made space for the real version of me. When the holidays came and went, and the only contact from my parents was a forwarded photo of Daniel's kids sitting on Santa's lap, I didn't feel bitterness anymore, just distance. A clear, defined line between their world and mine. Occasionally, I'd see something, a childhood ornament, an old birthday card shoved into the back of a drawer, and feel a pang, not of regret, but of what could have been if things had gone differently, if love had been a little less conditional, if curiosity had been stronger than judgment. Carly once asked me if I wanted to invite them for a visit, just to see the place, to show them what we'd built, what our life looked like. I remember sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the stack of fresh-baked bread cooling on the counter, thinking about how my mother would find fault in the crooked floorboards or complain about the bugs or act surprised that Carly could bake from scratch. And I said no. Not because I was afraid, not anymore, but because I had nothing to prove. Their absence was not a gap in my life. It was a border I had drawn to protect what mattered. But that doesn't mean I never imagined it. I did. More than once. I pictured Mom standing in the garden, pretending to be impressed by the tomato vines, Dad sitting stiffly on the porch rocker, Daniel making a comment about how it was quaint. And in those imagined scenes, I was always calm, always polite, always quietly triumphant, not because I needed their approval, but because I wanted them to see, just once, what they had missed, what they had chosen not to know. The wedding came and went like a secret summer storm, beautiful, brief, witnessed only by the people who mattered. We stood barefoot under the arch Carly built herself, surrounded by wildflowers and friends from town, and I wore a dress that didn't cost a fortune, but fit like it was made for me. We didn't send out announcements. We didn't tag it on social media. It was ours. Entirely, unapologetically ours. I kept one photo on my desk, the two of us standing under the wide blue sky, Carly's head on my shoulder, our hands clasped and still dusted with soil from the morning's gardening. I never hid it, but I also never offered it up for approval. I didn't mail it to my parents. I didn't send it to Daniel. I simply let it be what it was, proof of a life well lived, even if no one back home ever asked to see it. And that, I think, was the thing that stung the most, not that they disapproved, not that they disagreed, but that they simply didn't care enough to ask. Not once. Not ever. They asked about jobs, about weather, about traffic. They asked if I was staying busy, if I kept in touch with old friends, if I'd thought about moving somewhere closer. But they never asked if I was happy. Never asked who made me laugh, who held my hand when I couldn't sleep, who knew the sound of my heartbeat in the middle of the night. So I stopped volunteering pieces of myself. I stopped offering up stories like sacrifices, hoping someone might finally say, "I see you." And instead, I lived. I built. I loved. Not in defiance of them, but in defiance of the silence they left behind. Because some lives aren't loud. Some victories don't come with fanfare. Some revolutions are quiet, slow, personal. Mine came in the form of a creaky porch, a messy garden, and a woman who never once made me feel like I needed to be anything other than exactly who I was. And for the first time, that was enough. The morning after the dinner, the house was unnervingly quiet in that particular way only childhood homes can be after the tension has spilled over and hardened into something cold and unmoving, where even the clink of a spoon against porcelain seems to echo louder than it should, as though the walls themselves are listening, waiting, trying to predict which one of us will make the next move and whether it'll be a peace offering or just another quiet act of retreat. I woke early, not because I couldn't sleep, but because I didn't want to wake to the sound of someone else controlling the narrative of the day before I had a chance to reclaim it. Carly was still at the hotel. We had agreed on that boundary, not because she wasn't strong enough to face them, but because I wanted to handle this part alone, not out of pride or martyrdom, but because some scars have to be shown without a witness for them to stop feeling like secrets. Downstairs, the kitchen smelled like burnt toast and tension. My father sat at the end of the table in his robe, newspaper spread before him like a shield, pretending to read but barely flipping the pages, clearly aware of my presence but unwilling to acknowledge it until I made the first move. We had long ago established that dance, him choosing passivity and distance in the hopes that silence would spare him from the discomfort of having to choose sides, and me learning, over years, that expecting him to step in was a fool's errand. He mumbled something about coffee. I nodded. We didn't speak again. My mother was in the garden, her silhouette visible through the kitchen window as she crouched near the raised beds, fussing over the same basil she'd replanted 3 times this year, the same way she fussed over everything: plants, guests, furniture, and people. Always tending, always curating, always trying to impose control over what was never hers to fix in the first place. She didn't look up when I opened the door. She just kept working, digging her hands into the soil like it could somehow ground her in a reality she hadn't prepared for. I stood for a moment on the back step, taking in the image of her in that old sun hat, the one she wore for church garden parties and charity events, not for real work, and I realized that for all her precision and curated appearances, she had no idea how to survive in a moment she didn't script herself. I stepped down onto the gravel path and said her name, not harshly, not softly, just enough to let her know this was happening now. She straightened slowly, wiped her hands on her apron like she hadn't just been elbow-deep in denial, and turned toward me with a smile that faltered under the weight of everything we had both left unsaid. I thought you left already, she said, not quite accusatory, but not quite warm either, a statement meant to draw lines, to create distance before I could close it. I needed to talk to you, I said, and she nodded, but didn't invite me to sit. So I stood, arms folded, the sun already hot on the back of my neck, and asked the question I'd carried in my chest for over a decade, the one that had taken on different shapes over the years, but always returned to the same point. Why did you never ask? She blinked, that practiced pause of someone deciding which version of the truth would make this easier. Ask what? You know what, I said, not to accuse, not to wound, but because I needed her to admit, for once, that she had chosen not to know. She looked away, out toward the fence line, where the neighbor's dog barked in the distance, and I watched her face shift, not into regret, not into shame, but into the same familiar defense she had always worn when confronted with the limits of her love. I just wanted you to be happy, she said at last, the words as empty as the envelopes she used to send without writing anything personal inside. You wanted me to be what you could understand, I replied, and for a moment, she didn't deny it. She didn't flinch either, which almost hurt more, that after all this time, she still didn't see how much that kind of curated love costs the person who receives it. She sighed, a long, slow exhale, like she was the one exhausted by all of this. Why now? She asked. Why bring this up now, after all these years? Because last night, in front of everyone, you asked me when I was going to settle down, I said, and I saw her stiffen, just slightly. And I realized in that moment that you don't even know I already did. That I have a wife. That we have a home. That we've built something good and real and lasting, and you never asked. She opened her mouth, closed it again, then said something I'll never forget, not because it surprised me, but because it confirmed everything I had feared for years. Well, you never made it easy to ask. There it was. The reframe. The blame. The subtle twist of the knife that says the silence wasn't her fault, that my hiding wasn't a response to her rejection, but an act of defiance she now uses as evidence against me. I didn't argue. I didn't beg for understanding. I just reached into my bag, pulled out the sealed envelope I had written the night before, with shaky hands, alone in the hotel room while Carly slept, and handed it to her. She looked at it like it might bite her. "What is this?" "It's everything you never asked," I said. "But you should read it when you're alone." I turned then, not dramatically, not angrily, but with a kind of finality that felt more permanent than any slammed door or shouted goodbye. I walked through the garden path, past the herbs and the fence and the ghosts of my childhood, and didn't look back until I reached the car. As we pulled out of the driveway, I glanced through the side mirror and saw her standing there, envelope in hand, face unreadable. Maybe she would read it. Maybe she would cry. Maybe she'd rip it up and pretend it never existed. It didn't really matter anymore. What mattered was that I had said what needed to be said. Because silence protects nothing. And pretending is not the same as love. And this time, I wasn't the one pretending. There's a particular kind of power in knowing you no longer owe anyone an explanation, especially when the people you once bent over backward to please finally come face to face with the full scope of what they chose not to see. And while revenge is often imagined as something loud and dramatic, something with slammed doors or public shaming or fiery speeches, the most devastating kind, the one that lingers and eats at a person slowly, is the kind you deliver in silence, calmly, with a steady hand and the unshakable certainty that nothing you could say would hurt them more than simply showing them the life they had no part in, not because you shut them out, but because they never tried to come in. And so, as Carly and I pulled into our gravel driveway later that evening, the sky melting into a deep lavender above us and the familiar scent of honeysuckle wafting in from the fence line, I felt a strange lightness settle into my chest. Not because the wound had healed, it hadn't, and maybe it never fully would, but because I finally understood that closure wasn't something they could give me, it was something I had already built for myself, brick by brick, year after quiet year. Carly didn't ask how it went, she never did, because she knew that when I was ready, I would tell her everything, not out of obligation but because she was the only person in my life who had never once demanded to be let in but was always there, patiently waiting when I chose to open the door. We sat on the porch with mugs of tea, her hand resting on my leg, our eyes tracking the fireflies blinking lazily across the yard, and I told her about the conversation in the garden, about my mother's carefully rehearsed indifference, about the way she clutched the envelope like it contained something venomous instead of the truth she had spent decades avoiding. I told her about the look on my father's face as I left, a flicker of something that might have been regret, or just discomfort at being caught in the crossfire of emotions he had always chosen to ignore. I told her how it felt, not victorious, not exactly, but firm, like finding your footing after years of trying to balance on shifting sand. And then I told her about the letter, the real letter, not the one my mother had read, but the one I had spent weeks writing late at night, after she was asleep, pouring every word I'd never been allowed to say into paragraphs that dripped with quiet rage and unfiltered honesty. The one she would never receive, not because I was afraid of the consequences, but because I knew she didn't deserve the intimacy of my rawest truth. That letter, the one Carly helped me edit, that we laughed over and cried through and rewrote until every sentence cut exactly the way it was meant to, was tucked neatly into a private drive, along with a collection of photos and short videos chronicling our life together. The day we signed the deed to the house with paint still drying on the walls, the evening we danced barefoot in the rain after finishing the porch repairs, the quiet moments spent reading on opposite ends of the couch with our feet tangled under a shared blanket. It was not a life built for display, but it was beautiful in ways my mother would never comprehend. That night, for the first time in years, I opened the family group chat, the one I had muted long ago, filled with endless photos of Daniel's kids in various sports uniforms and holiday table spreads that I hadn't been invited to. And I posted the video, not with any dramatic caption, not with any warning or context, just the footage of us on our wedding day, standing beneath the wildflower arch Carly had built herself, sunlight streaking across her face, our friends clapping softly in the background as we kissed, simple and joyful and entirely ours. I didn't wait for a reaction. I didn't scroll back to see who read it. I just closed the app, turned off my phone, and slid it into the drawer where I kept the few keepsakes from my childhood that still meant something, not out of nostalgia, but as a reminder that I had come from that world and still found a way to build something better. The next morning, there was a message waiting for me from Daniel. Not long, not emotional, just a single line, I didn't know. And for a split second, I considered replying, maybe even forgiving him, but then I remembered all the times he'd stood beside me at holidays and said nothing while my mother made jokes at my expense. All the birthdays he had attended where he never once asked me who I was seeing or what I was building. All the years he had lived in comfort while I clawed my way toward peace in a house that was never designed to hold my truth. And I left the message unread. I don't believe in burning bridges unless the bridge was built on a fault line to begin with, and by the time the smoke clears, you realize you're not trapped, you're just finally walking your own path without having to explain your every step. Carly brought me coffee that morning with a slice of cinnamon toast and a quiet smile, and we sat at the kitchen table beneath the framed photo of our wedding day, the light filtering in through the windows casting soft shadows on the table, and I realized that revenge. Real revenge, the kind that leaves a mark without ever needing to shout, isn't about hurting the people who hurt you. It's about showing them, clearly and unequivocally, that you're thriving without them. And maybe, just maybe, that's the punishment they never saw coming, not the silence, not the distance, not the withheld invitations or the absence at holidays, but the undeniable truth that we no longer need them, not for love, not for approval, not even for closure. Because we already found all of that in the soil of a backyard garden, in the brushstrokes of a painting done just for joy, in the quiet laughter between two women who chose each other, over and over, despite everything. And as the breeze picked up and the wind chimes sang their soft metallic tune, I looked out at the world Carly and I had built, messy, imperfect, radiant, and I knew I had finally settled down. They just never cared enough to notice. And that, in the end, was their loss. Not mine.